How's it going today?
How about you?
That's okay. It's going. So we are going to switch to Eclipse for doing the programming assignments 3 and 4 and 5. And we're going to wrap up some things with IntelliJ because I want to address the troubles we were having yesterday with the mouse listener and a few other things like that. But then we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about Eclipse, and I'm going to want you to install Eclipse, and I'm going to want you to install Java either version 8 or 9, nothing newer than that though, unless you want to take a chance and see if Eclipse will work with 10 or 11 or 12. Last I tried, it wasn't working well with any version above 9. So I'm just going to say use version 8 or 9. If you do anything beyond that, you're kind of at your own risk, including whether or not it'll run when I try to grade your projects. So strongly recommend Java 8 or 9.
We already have, say, 11 or 12. But we have to get rid of it in the meantime.
I don't think you have to get rid of it, but you can install 8 or 9, and then in Eclipse you can point to that JDK, and it'll use that, but your other stuff will still use the newer one. So we'll talk about Eclipse and how to download it and install it and put in the swing classes and all that kind of stuff, and then we'll start playing with it some more. And tomorrow is going to be open lab as usual on Thursdays, but if you're not successful by tomorrow getting Eclipse installed and running with swing, you definitely want to come to class tomorrow with your equipment, and we can sit down and we can go through it as a group. And if I get a volunteer or two who has nothing installed on their laptop for Java or Swing or anything else, right, we can go ahead and we can do that on the screen and pin down all the steps. The tricky part with doing this is I've got so many versions of Java and so many versions of Eclipse and NetBeans and IntelliJ and all these other things on my laptop that if I try to reproduce the experience of someone installing it for the first time, I'm going to miss steps because stuff has already been done on mine. So I did this to some degree last night on a Windows install. I booted up under Windows, and it was a bit of a nightmare because it had, 10 gazillion updates to do because I haven't used Windows in a month and stuff like that. So that was not terribly informative. So if you've already got Eclipse running and it works great and you're happy with it, fine. Otherwise, tomorrow would be a good time during class to come in and do the install. We can do it as a group and get all of that nailed down. So I want to finish up some things with IntelliJ, but any questions before we get to that? Because I'd rather talk about like PA2 questions or things along those lines first. All right, on to IntelliJ then. And with IntelliJ, I think we can get it to work. I've got it to work for me, to where I can do all the things that we need to do. But it's a very particular set of steps, and some other people are doing the same set of steps and getting different behavior. And they have to do some other set of steps to get their installation to work the same way, and it's kind of strange. So let's just start with a new project. And again, what we're doing here is going to translate to Eclipse. It's going to translate to NetBeans, right? The code's certainly going to translate, but even the procedures that we're going through are basically the same. It's just different particulars depending on the IDE. So I'll just call this Untitled 1. And so I'll come down to source, I'll right click, I'll say new dialog. And I'll just call it main. I'll get rid of the code for the buttons. I'll switch to my form, I'll get rid of these buttons and all of that stuff. And now if I take a button and I drop it over here, got a button. Okay, so we were trying to make a panel that would pay attention to mouse movement. And if you come down here and drop this in here and it's not a class that already exists, things don't work. You create the class and it still won't let you hook it up to this thing. So you got to create the class first. So I'm going to say new Java class, and I'll just call this MP for my panel. And I'll say this extends JPanel. And I'll Alt-Enter to import. So public void paint graphics G. So there's the superclasses paint method, and then I'm going to say g.fill oval. And we'll draw an oval. And I'm going to build it before I try to drop it into my form. Thanks. And now I'm going to say non-palette component. And I'm going to drop that in here, and my class is going to be MP. And I'm going to say create binding, and if we're lucky it works perfectly. It's a tiny little class, tiny little object, and if I grab a corner to try to expand it, it doesn't take, but you can see the oval being drawn in there. But for some reason doing this doesn't actually do anything, so we're just going to do our trick where we set the alignment to be fill so that it's large. And now if we run it, you got to go to main.java to be able to select the main class. And now if we run it, there's our window. Okay, so this was where we got to partway through yesterday. And then I was trying to add a mouse listener. And so I did right click and said create listener. And I went to mouse listener, and I selected mouse moved. And when we wired all that up, nothing was happening when we moved the mouse. It wasn't calling this code. I have no idea why these two options are in here. But if instead of using that, I right click, I say create listener, and instead of saying mouse listener, I do mouse motion listener, and now I only have the option of dragged or moved. I can do mouse moved. And when I do that, this is going to work now.
Could the other ones be for like a click and drag?
No, that's for dragged versus moved. And I also tried clicking and dragging. It's a different way to wire up motion listener, but I don't know why it's giving you two options that need different approaches. I'm sure there's a reason. So this method is called with a mouse event, so I'm just going to say mouse event.getX. And we're just going to print out the results of the getX and the getY methods. And I'm going to run that. And there's our rectangle, but now when I move the mouse around, it's showing me the X and Y coordinates. So that does work the way it's supposed to. You just have to make sure you pick the right mouse moved option. And this is relative to the panel itself. So up here is around where the origin is 0, 0. So we can do things, and we did some of this in the afternoon class yesterday, where we use this to get coordinates, and we move the rectangle around to follow the mouse. And you can catch that in the video, but since we're walking away from IntelliJ anyway, I'd rather do this in Eclipse. So questions about this? And again, it's going to be a common motif, right? We're going to have a choice of either looking at Java code itself or looking at some sort of visual representation of it. And in the visual representation, we can basically take things and drop them where we want. and we can connect them to action by creating listeners, and then we can go from there. All right, well, let's talk about Eclipse then. So if you Google Eclipse download, get to eclipse.org, Eclipse downloads. I'm on Linux, so it's going to give me different options, but Eclipse IDE 2019-03 is a good one to use. That's the latest version. It seems to work well. Before you download Eclipse, make sure that you have a Java Development Kit, JDK, installed on your system. And as I say, ideally you want JDK 8 or 9. Eight seems to be the most popular choice, and it's the one I've been using for a few years, and it seems to work well with Eclipse, but 9 seems to also work. So make sure you have a JDK, download Eclipse, install that. Now if you don't have a Java kit on your system yet, you can go to JDK download. You want Java SE, okay, so that's the standard edition as opposed to the Enterprise edition EE, so SE is the most basic one. And you want Kit 8, okay, not 11 or 12. And hopefully you get to a page that looks something like this. So different versions, they all kind of come out like this. You have to accept the license agreement, and then you can choose what you want to download. So if you're Windows, download the x64. If you're Linux, download from here, and so on. And when you do this, it'll take you to a login page. And because 8 is considered an outdated version, for some reason, they make you log in. So you got to set up an Oracle account, so this gets to be a lot of fun. And give them a real email address, because they send you a confirmation page. So you have to create an account if you don't already have one. And it's fairly painless. Give them an email address, pick a password that satisfies their criteria. The rest of the stuff doesn't seem to matter, right? Work phone, I just put in 10 ones, and that seemed to work fine. Zip code, I put in 5 ones. So do this, they send you an email with confirmation link. Click on that, and then when you come back here, you can log in, and once you log in, it starts your download. It's a pain, you only got to do it once. Keep the download file so when you get to a new laptop someday, you can still install it from the same file that you downloaded, and then you don't have to go through all of this in the future. So install the JDK first, and then install Eclipse, because Eclipse will look for the JDK, and if it doesn't find it, it'll try to get you to install JDK 12 and all kinds of weird things. So steps. Install JDK 8, which means you need an Oracle account. Step 2, install Eclipse. If you want to do this on the Collaboratorium, Eclipse is not installed on there, but when you try to install Eclipse, it'll download an installer for you. Okay, it's like install64.exe. If you throw that on a flash drive, you can plug that into the computers in the Collaboratorium, run that, it'll just download Eclipse, and it's a pretty quick process at that point. Otherwise, you gotta go through 2 or 3 steps. So the thing that you download when you try to install, save that on a flash drive if you like. So you go through all of that, and you get to where Eclipse is running for you. So I have an older version of Eclipse. And so our third step, and this is a one-time step unless you're on the Collaboratorium, because the Collaboratorium's machines reset every time. install Swing inside Eclipse. Okay, so how do you install Swing? Go to Help, go to Install New Software. Up here where it says Work With, select all available sites. And then come down to type filter text and just type Swing. And it takes it a while the first time that you do this. Catching children of 4s. There we go. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is select Swing Designer and say Next. And it's already installed on my system, so I'm not going to install it again. But if this is a fresh installation, that'll show up. Select Swing Designer, say Next, and just click through the defaults. It'll ask if you want to restart the IDE. Go ahead and say yes, and then when it comes up, you're ready to roll. Okay, so try to get all of that done sometime today so that by tomorrow you know if that's successful or if you need help. And if you need help, then come to class tomorrow. Or come to class anyway. Alright, so let's see what Eclipse looks like. File, new Java project. So, so again, the first time that you do this, it's going to look different, and since I've already done Java development on here, but the first time you do this, it'll bring up a welcome window, and you want to close that welcome window, and I think it ends up looking like this. So just click on this thing on the left that brings up what's called a package explorer. So everything is considered a package, right? When you start working on a test program, that's one package. It's going to go in its own directory. It's going to have its own path to all of the files. When you start working on a second thing, start a new project, okay? Don't have one project with 5 or 6 different things going on in it. If you're making PA3 and it's got 6 different classes, that's all part of one project. But if you're writing a test code to play around with scanners, new project. If you're writing some test code to play around with linked lists, new project, right? Unless you intend these to be mixed together. So keep everything separate. Let's make a Java project. I'm just going to call this frame test. And this is where you can say, if you have multiple versions of Java, this is where you can select which one you want to use. One of the places, and then you can come down here and specify where those are stored, so I can help you with that. So mostly just take defaults. I'm just going to say finish. So here's my frame test. Alright, so I'm going to right click and say new. I can say class, and I can call this main. I can say go ahead and make a public static void main if I want. And finish, and there's my class. So there's, I should make my font bigger. So there's a hello world, and to run it, just click this little standard run button, and there's the output, hello. Okay, so pretty straightforward to do rapid development. The first time you try to run it, it'll say, do you want to save the changes that you made? And you can say yes. There's a little checkbox to say, always save my changes before I run, and then it'll never ask you again. Alright, so we can do that, we can run that, and there's our new output. Okay, so let's close that project. So I'm going to right click, close project. Let's make a new project. Let's do some graphics. So we'll do frame test 2. Okay, so I'm going to say file new, come down to other, click on that, scroll down to window builder, expand that, scroll down to swing designer, expand that, and then say JFrame. And once you do this once, those will stay expanded for the next time you do this. So we're creating a new JFrame, give it a name, I'll just call it main. And bingo, we got tons of code written. And if we run this, we got a frame. Doesn't have anything, doesn't do anything, but it's an empty frame. Okay, again, there's a source tab and there's a design tab. Be really careful changing code when you're playing around with this code that's automatically generated. Some of it you can change, some of it if you change it will kind of break things. Because when I switch to the design tab, it's going to read this code and figure out what the frame should look like, and it's going to display it for me. So here's my frame. And we're going to drop buttons on there and panels and connect them to actions and do all the same sort of stuff that we've been doing so far with IntelliJ. So you're going to do one thing first before you do anything else, which is we're going to change the layout manager, unless you like the layout managers that we've been using. So over here under layouts, left click absolute, come in here, the border should turn green, your cursor should have a little plus sign, just left click once. And that gives us what's called an absolute layout manager. It lets you put components exactly where you want, and that's where they'll be. So I can take a J button and I can drop it anywhere I like. I can drop it right here. There's my J button.
Why doesn't IntelliJ do that?
I don't know, because lots of people ask for an absolute layout manager, and the response is always like, if you do that, then you have to write lots of code to move things around when you resize, and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know why there's a resistance to it. Alright, so I had some lag there, but anyway, we got 3 buttons in here now. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a J panel just for kicks. So there's a J panel, it's tiny, but you can grab a corner and make it bigger. I don't know what's going on down here. I got something interacting with something. But anyway, so you can resize this however you want. If you want to make it visible, we can select that panel, come down under properties, and we can say border. So click on that, let's give it a beveled border, make it easier to see. And so now if we run this, there's our frame. We got 3 buttons that do nothing. We've got a J panel that does nothing. And you know, the downside is these things are in fixed locations, so if you resize, they don't move around. And if you make your window tall and skinny, it doesn't automatically move the J panel to somewhere where you can see it. But for first purposes, that's probably easier to work with. Alright, so replay the video to follow those steps if you want to try making this work at home. But once you're at this point, it's fairly straightforward to do design of GUIs and other interfaces. So if we want to tie actions into buttons, we can right click, we can say add event handler, action, action performed. There's also a shortcut. We can just double click on the button and that'll bring us into an action performed piece of code. So I can say system out print line, button has been clicked. And now if I run that, every time I click this button, it tells me button has been clicked. if you So the main thing you have here, you have your design window where you're dragging and dropping components. You have a palette which has things that you can put into your design window, and the main ones we're going to play with are the layout managers. And so we're in absolute layout, but you can use flow layout like IntelliJ uses, all these different options. There's containers, things that hold other things like panels and frames and so on, and then there's just raw components. So buttons, text fields, radio buttons, etc., etc. And you can just drop them wherever you like. And then for any component, there's a property box, which lets you control things like the name of the object. So this is called button new button, this one's called button new button 1, and so on. The bounds, which you can either set here by editing text, or you can grab a corner and change it like that. The text, which you can set down here. And other things, you can set the color and where the alignment of the label is and all sorts of stuff like that. So all the properties that you would hope to have. And to run, just click the run button. So the goal here is to be able to create forms where you drop components on and then spend your time writing code to respond to events, to modify the appearance of things, etc., etc. And this part, putting the components there, I don't want that to be like taking a lot of your time. So once you get it set up, it's really just drag and drop. But as you're polishing your projects, like PA3 for example, right, you can spend a lot of time tailoring the appearance of things, right, setting the colors, changing the type of bevel that you have, or the appearance of the buttons or things like that, right? And that's potentially really fun to be doing. But I don't want you to have to struggle with that just to get something working. Okay, so drag and drop, get something working, and then you can spend time tailoring the layout. So questions so far? Is this making sense?
It seems like IntelliJ, but it's way easier to format things the way you want to.
It seems easier to me too, and in all fairness, it may be that I just don't know how to use IntelliJ, right? And it may be that, you know, somebody who's an expert at it would say, oh no, you're doing that all wrong, you should do it like this. And it might be easier. But the way that I'm showing you is the way that I got from messing with it and looking at tutorials and so on. So it may not be IntelliJ's fault. But you know, it's going to depend where you go. I'm told by some students that WSUV doesn't really care what you use IDE-wise. So some people are using IntelliJ, some people are using Eclipse, some people are on the command line. When you go to a job, chances are, if it's a bigger company, they're going to have a standard environment that they expect everybody to use. And it may be Eclipse, and next week it may be IntelliJ. So adaptability is good. And we're also going to spend some time looking at NetBeans. And NetBeans is finally working for me. And it's very similar, right? It's different specifics, but the things you're doing are going to feel exactly like what we're doing here, what we were doing in IntelliJ. And it's kind of like programming languages. You know, you learn C and somebody says, well, you have to use Python. And it's like, okay, well, I'll learn Python. Or you have to use Perl because someone read about Perl on a plane trip and they decided the whole company is going to use Perl now. So you learn Perl.
That company didn't last long.
No, they're still around. Yeah.
Is that a personal anecdote?
Yes, it is. I won't name names. All right, so let's do some drawing in our panel. Okay, so this is what we were trying to do the past few days. Let's go ahead and make our own version of a panel. So you can also shortcut. You can just click on this little C with a plus to create a new class instead of doing File, New. So I'm going to call this my panel, and I'm going to leave everything else the same. And I'm going to say it extends JPanel. So public void paint graphics G. Call the superclass paint method. So it was giving me some help there that I ignored. Could be useful. Same thing, click on here. It's going to say, do you want to import JPanel? Yes. And it brought in graphics at the same time. So there's my JPanel class, which is called myPanel. So I'll save that. Okay, well, if I run this, it's not going to use that because this thing over here is a JPanel, not a myPanel. So we're going to go into the source code. Well, let's look at the design. So what is this panel called? It's called panel. Okay. So let's go into the source code and let's find where panel is. It's created right here. JPanel. Panel equals new JPanel. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to call this a myPanel. I'm going to set it equal to a new myPanel. And now if I run that, it's calling myPanel. Okay, so pretty easy to hook your own version of classes into your code. Right? So I said be careful when you're editing this code. That's a perfectly fine thing to do. But if I delete this and I move it somewhere else and I start putting in some print statements, things like that, it's possible when I go to the design window, it's going to fail to bring this up. And it's going to say something's wrong, would you like me to fix it? And you may have to do that a few times, and eventually it should bring this up. But renaming the type of thing that panel is to be a myPanel instead of a JPanel, that's perfectly fine. And that's the way to set this up. Another thing about this is you can see a little clearer what exactly is going on. So over here, line 1 says import, and then the next line is 12. There's actually a little plus sign right here, so this is code folding. All these IDEs support this. It's got a bunch of lines, 11 lines of code that are all kind of doing the same thing. And it's thinking, you know, you probably don't really want to see that in the beginning of your code, because this is stuff that I wrote, I being the IDE, right, Eclipse. This is stuff that Eclipse wrote. It's probably not super important to you. If you see it, then when you come into your code, the first thing you see is a bunch of stuff that like isn't relevant to you. So this is collapsed, but you can expand it if you like by just clicking on the plus. So here's my class main. It's an extension of a JFrame. That's why we get the border and stuff. Yes?
Could you do something similar that we did in C where you have to include file all the deckers?
Not really. I don't think Java, it should have an include option, but I don't know what it would be. Because I don't think there's a preprocessor. But you're in an IDE, so copy and paste and then fold it. That's interesting though. I've never thought about that. All right, so private JPanel content pane. That's this thing up here. So the JFrame is the whole window, which has the title bar and the maximize button and all of that stuff. And sitting inside that is a content pane. Okay, which is this thing that's surrounded by this little black border here. And all the stuff that I'm putting on this thing is going inside the content pane. The content pane was created for me. And that's what's happening right here. So it creates content pane equals new JPanel. It sets a border. And then, right, main is a JFrame. So I've got all the methods available from JFrame. So set default close operation is a method that's available inside a JFrame. And it says if the frame closes, what should I do? And it's setting that to a value which is JFrame exit on close. Well, that's a static field inside the JFrame class which says that when you close the frame, the whole thing should exit. So that's why when you hit the X, your program stops. This is setting the size of the JFrame. If I change this to 1450 instead of 450, I get a really wide frame. But I could also have done that in the design window by picking this and selecting the frame and then just changing the size like that. And it'll tell you how big it is. So right now it's 676 by 463. Well, I moved it a little bit there at the end. But so now that's the size that it's picking, and this is also where it's located, X and Y. So really direct connection between what you see here in this visual design window and the code. Right? And basically when you drag and drop and move things around and set properties, it generates or modifies code in the .java file. So this window is really just a shorthand way of writing and manipulating Java code. And all the stuff that you're doing over here is available inside the .java file. So if we weren't using an IDE, this is what we would be teaching, what these different things do, what content pane set border does, and so on, and you'd be writing this code, and you'd run it, and you'd get your pop-up. You can take this code, and you can put it in VI, right? Save it, compile it with Java-C, run it with Java, and your GUIs pop up. And you don't need Eclipse or IntelliJ or anything else. It's just that you need to understand all these swing components like content panes and JFrames and so on to know what to write. So this is really just saving us from learning that and writing all this stuff in. So we have a J button with a label of 1 that's constructed by saying new J button with a label. It's a string argument. And that creates a J button called button new button. If I come over here to my design window and I click on that button, I can come to variable name and I can call this my first button. And now if I look at my Java code, it says my first button equals new J button. Right, so it's changed the name of our object. And then we add an action listener and we write a piece of code for action performed, which tells us the button has been clicked. This sets the dimensions of the button, and this adds it to that content pane, that JPanel that we're putting everything in. And it puts it at location 3232, and this is the width and the height. Same for the second and third buttons. Here's the panel that we're creating. This is the My panel. This is where we set the border, because normally it doesn't have a border. So it sets the border to this. This sets the location, the dimensions of it, and then it adds it to the content pane. So every component that we want to see, we basically construct the component. We set up 0 or more properties of it, border, bounds, label, etc. And then we add it to the content pane. So that's all what the constructor does for the main class. And the main method, you know, public static void main string args. We're going to talk about runnables in a few weeks. This is basically threaded programming. It's creating a thread, a separate execution stream to run this. But basically what it does is 2 lines of code. It creates a new frame object called main object called frame. So it says frame is equal to a new main. So it calls this constructor, which constructs a JFrame, because a main is a JFrame plus some other stuff. And it saves the result in this variable frame, this object, and then it just calls the setVisible method. And so at the end of this, I'm going to print a message saying main is exiting now. And when I run this, it tells me main is exiting now, goodbye, but my frame is still here, and if I click the 1 button, I still get text. So your main program runs really quickly. It's basically a constructor, right? It constructs the frame and then it's done. It leaves. But the frame is still sticking around, and because the frame is still sticking around, Swing is running in the background waiting for events. And when an event happens, it knows that, you know, this piece of code was asked to be notified, and so it makes a call to that piece of code. And then when you close this window, it said exit on close, and so everything stops. In Eclipse, when you're running, you have this little red button down here, right, which tells you you're running. You can stop that process by clicking that. Or if you stop your process some other way, that button turns gray. It tells you that you're done. And so just to close the loop with where we were yesterday, let's make this drawing area bigger. Let's say right, add event handler. Let's do mouse motion. So here under mouse, we only have options for clicking, pressing, releasing, or entering and exiting the area. Under mouse motion, we can say dragged or moved. So let's say moved. So it calls this with an argument called arg0, so I can say arg0.getX. So I'll just print a message saying the mouse is at, and I'll print out the X and Y coordinates. And so if we run this, anytime we move within this panel, it shows us the mouse coordinates. If we move outside, it doesn't, because the mouse listener is tied to this panel. Does that make sense? So the trickiest part of all of this is just getting Eclipse installed, right? And it seems like if you install a JDK first and then install Eclipse, it plays pretty nicely. If you try to install Eclipse without the JDK, it'll say I can't find the JDK, and it'll try to get you to install a later version of it. And it may work, it may not, I don't know. So last year, like I said, we ran into a problem where Eclipse got up to version 10, and Window Builder, the thing that manages these windows so you can drag and drop, was not running. And the message it was giving people was this version of Window Builder needs at least Java version 8, and you're running with Java version 0, and that's too old. And somebody went through the code and figured out what was going on. Well, we were running with Java version 10, and it was looking at the last digit, because normally it's, you know, version 7, version 8, version 9. So it was just picking up the last digit and saying that's the version of Java, and 0 is less than 8, so that's too old.
Y2K strikes again.
Yeah, so don't be that person, right? Use integer.parseInt and some string things and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's been fixed or not. At the time, which was a year ago, the discussions in the forums were basically saying there were no developers for Window Builder anymore. And so there was nobody to fix this, but they were saying, you know, if you want to fix it yourself, that would be really cool. So I don't know if it's been fixed or not. So if you want to try it with a newer version of Java, let us know how that works. All right, so punchline, give this a shot, right? We're going to do this again in the afternoon class, and then tomorrow, if you want to have help installing Eclipse, getting this to run, and so on, come to class tomorrow. And then Friday, we will talk about PA3, and my plan is PA3 is going to be done on Eclipse. Okay, so we'll talk about how to export things so that you can submit them and so on and so forth, as well as all the details of PA3, which means I have to write PA3 tonight or tomorrow. So hopefully that goes okay. All right, any other questions, comments? Good to go? All right, I will see you tomorrow then.